Dante wrote, "The path to paradise begins in hell." Join Deacon Prendergast and David Fortin as they discuss the tools men need to build the domestic church and the spiritual weapons to defend it. This is Through the Fire.
None of us are immune to suffering. Even the Son of Man, as told in John chapter 11, verse 35, says that Jesus wept. I'm David Fortin, joined by my good friend, Deacon Prendergast.
Hey, Dave, how's it going?
Good, buddy. Welcome to another episode of Through the Fire. Deacon, sounds like we're talking about suffering.
Yeah, suffering. Who likes to suffer? Dave, do you know anyone? I mean, it's kind of insane. Do you know anyone that enjoys to suffer?
No, I don't think anybody can really give a good, well, I think we're going to talk about it in this episode.
Well, we both know plenty of people that would like to see someone else suffer.
Yeah.
Right?
Unfortunately.
Sadly enough, we live in that kind of world.
We do.
You know, there's people out there that, you know, they enjoy watching the pains of others. And that's nothing new, right? I think it was Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen who would talk about, he made a comment about applauding inside of Mass.
Yeah.
And, you know, he remarked that at Calvary, when Christ was being crucified, they applauded there also. So there are certainly people who enjoy seeing the suffering of others.
I actually saw a study saying that a significant number of people enjoy seeing something taken away from someone as opposed to someone being given something. It's a weird kind of thing that's going on in society where people want to see things taken away from people and not given to, justice not given to people.
I wonder if these are the same people that slow down at car accidents, you know, not necessarily to say a prayer for somebody in hopes that they didn't get hurt, but to see, you know, the horror of it. So, but, you know, this is why it's so important. The work that we're doing is so important so that we could help to properly order how a man should live.
Yeah.
You know, it's important for us to properly order because, you know, like the other thing that drives me nuts is you watch the sitcoms. You watch these sitcoms, and it's like the dad in the family is always some dopey guy that
buffoon.
Messes everything up, and he's a buffoon. You know, and he's blamed for everything, and the kids are running the house, and it's just horrible. That is disorder. That is not the order that God put forth for how a family should operate. So we're talking about suffering. And yes, in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 35, it clearly says, and Jesus wept. Now, to put that in context, this is part of the story where his best friend Lazarus had died. You know, he was told, you know, Lazarus is dying, and Jesus waited a few days before heading out to go see him. When he finally got there, he was already dead. He was in the tomb for a couple of days. Martha approaches Jesus, and you know, we've heard the story, but this is the context of, you know, and Jesus wept. And what I think is really important about that is there's a couple of things, just that simple passage, but there's a couple of things that are really important. First of all, the word wept. We're not saying he shed a tear. We're not saying he was upset. He wept. And the word wept, it's in English translation. Forgive me because I don't know the original language translation. But the English word wept, it's akin to sobbing. You know, I mean, he cried. Because Lazarus was his best friend. You know, and when your best friend dies, well, hopefully, you're going to weep. So that's the first thing that's important for us to see is that, you know, this is not a minor thing. The second thing that I think is really important is the fact that Jesus was emotional. He wept. He was emotional. So, you know, people in society today, those that are professed Christians, it's important for us, of course, it's important for us to recognize and to relate to the fact that Jesus is the second person of the divine Trinity. But in this context, it's also incredibly important for us to recognize not only is Jesus 100% divine, 100% God, but he's also 100% human. He has emotions. He wept. He was feeling pain. This is important. It's important because what good is it to have a God who cannot genuinely relate to us? You know, I'm reminded of when I was in diaconate formation, we talked about God and different types of deities and different religions and all of that. And, you hear about the type of God that's the watchmaker. Okay, so the watchmaker God is the God that creates, like a watchmaker, creates a beautiful pocket watch. But once the watch is created, he places it on the counter, he slides it across the counter, it gets sold, and that watchmaker will never see that pocket watch again. And so the watchmaker God is the kind of God that created the universe, spun it into existence, and then walks away and has nothing to do with his creation. Well, that's not what we have in Jesus. Then there's this other type of God. And this other type of God, I remember being described as the absentee landlord. So the absentee landlord guy, if you think about an apartment building and how, you got a landlord that does not live in the apartment building. And so the absentee landlord God is the kind of God that created everything. And every once in a while, every so often, maybe he shows up to collect the rent, like when you die, judgment. That's the absentee landlord God, not personally involved in anything, but is there, when he thinks he needs to be there. Okay. That's not the kind of God that we have in Jesus either. The watchmaker God and the absentee landlord God, neither of them are going to have that human experience. What we do have, the kind of God that we do have, is a very personal God, a God that is intricately involved in everything that everybody's got going on every day, all the time. And this personal God is exactly who Jesus is. Jesus is 100% divine, and he is 100% human. And the fact that we have this piece of the story, and then there's another story, cleansing of the temple. Cleansing of the temple is another story where Jesus becomes emotional. In the story of the cleansing of the temple, he goes to the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, there's only one temple in Jerusalem, right? And he goes to the temple in Jerusalem, and it's during Passover, and he sees that they turn the place into a strip mall. They turn it into a marketplace, and they're selling stuff, and they got the money changers, which is kind of like, what we would have today with, with going to get different currencies for different values and all that. Anyway, and what does he do? It says in Scripture that he fashioned a whip. He fashioned a cord. Okay, well, to braid leather into a whip takes more than a couple of seconds. So here you have Jesus gathering together the leather pieces and then braiding them. And after he's fashioned a whip, then he goes around and he's flipping over tables and he's whipping people to chase them out of the temple. This is another moment in time where Jesus is emotional. So why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because it's important for us to have a foundational understanding that our God fully understands emotions, fully understands pain and suffering, and fully understands the human reaction to that suffering, to that pain.
Deacon, do you think that God understood suffering before he came as the second person of the Trinity? I mean, Satan came and really threw mankind under the bus by lying to us. Did God understand suffering at that point? Did God understand suffering when he came in the form of a human being?
Well, we have to start off with the understanding, we really have to start here. God does not need us for God to be God. But we need God for us to be us. Okay, let me say that again. God does not need us for God to be God, but we need God for us to be us. And so this is important. It's an important distinction. Everything that Jesus did, his entire mission was not for his own sake. Jesus' entire mission was not for his Father's sake. The entire mission was for our sake. And so everything that Jesus experienced was for our sake. We need to see that God has a full, visible understanding of what it is to be human. God does not need us for God to be God. But by Jesus having these emotions and by them being seen and by the drama being played out, everything that Jesus does is a lesson for us to learn how to get closer to him and how to get closer to God the Father. And so, did he understand human emotions? Of course he did, because he created us. That's like a software engineer not understanding the code that they're writing. Of course he understood it. But it needed to be played out for our sake, for us to understand it. It needed to be played out. Here's another point. And this is actually, Dave, I'm glad you brought this up. So one of the big things that a lot of our Protestant brothers would talk about is when Jesus was hanging on the cross. When he was hanging on the cross and he cries out, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" I have heard it described over and over and over again through Protestant circles that the only way that Jesus could die is if God the Father turned his back on him. And so in that moment, Jesus was experiencing having God the Father turn his back on him, which is absolutely not true. At no time did God the Father turn his back on Jesus or anyone, including you and I. It's just no way, no how would God the Father do that. What actually you find, and this goes back to the point of what I'm saying, that everything that Jesus does is an opportunity for us to learn and to get closer to him. Everything that Jesus does, it's a lesson. It's a catechetical teaching. And so just to kind of wrap this one up with a bow, everyone that's listening, when you have an opportunity, please, especially if you're one of our Protestant brothers and sisters that are listening, I beg you with all love and humility to spend a little bit of time with an open mind and an open heart about this issue. And so what I would like you to do is to go to your Bible to Psalm 22. Psalm 22. Now, we have to understand that back in the time of Jesus, kids growing up did not have the internet. They didn't have a library of books at home. It was way too expensive for anybody to have their own personal copies of anything. And so what would happen? Well, every boy went to Hebrew school. Every boy went to Sunday school, but it wasn't on Sunday. It was Hebrew school, right? Every boy went to have basic education. And in that basic education, they basically memorized some of the books that are in the Old Testament. And those that were a little bit more experienced went on to learn more and then more and then more and then more. And then maybe you were a disciple of a rabbi, which is what Jesus was accused of many times. You know, under whose authority are you teaching? Under what rabbi are you teaching? Okay. Because nobody had their own copies of Bibles and Old Testaments and Torahs, they would memorize. They would memorize what was in the Torah, or at least parts of it. So what became very, very common would be if you were to quote the first line or two of something, everybody else would kind of know exactly where you're going with that because they know it. They know it. It's part of the conversation. And so all you had to do was quote from memory the opening line to, let's say, one of the Psalms. And then the people you're talking to, they had a really good understanding as to what the Psalm was, what the message of the Psalm was, what the takeaway of the Psalm was. And all you had to do was throw out the first line. And so let's put this in context. Jesus is hanging on the cross, slowly drowning, not suffocating. He wasn't suffocating. He was drowning on his own bodily fluids as they filled up in his lungs. And so just imagine that. He's drowning on his own bodily fluids as it's filling up in his lungs, and he's barely able to breathe, let alone quote dissertations. So what does he do? He's the Lamb of God. He's the innocent victim. Now he's up on the cross. And what does he do for us? Gives us yet another teaching. And the teaching begins, Psalm 22. My God, why have you abandoned me? This psalm, if you read it through, it has a title to it. And the title is The Prayer of an Innocent Person. Jesus is teaching from the cross, yet another example of the fact that he is the innocent lamb. He is the unblemished lamb being sacrificed for everybody. And so this psalm goes through in verse 7, but I am a worm, hardly human, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. You go on to verse 17. Many dogs surround me. A pack of evildoers close in on me. Verse 19. They divided my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. Does this sound familiar or what?
It's describing the passion.
Yes, it is. Psalm 22 is describing the passion. Has nothing to do with God the Father turning his back on Jesus so that Jesus could fulfill the prophecy and die. God the Father never turned his back on Jesus or any of us. He just doesn't do that. And so suffering itself has to have meaning. Now, let me read this. This comes from John Paul II's apostolic letter, Salvific Dolores, on the Christian meaning of human suffering. And this is really powerful. If we're going to talk about why do we suffer, what's the purpose of suffering, sure, it's easy to say, well, gold is proven in fire, and okay, fine. But why do I have to have my guts ripped out? Why do I have to feel as though the world is crashing down on top of me? Okay, let me read this. The Redeemer suffered in place of man and for man. Every man has his own share in the redemption. Each one is also called to share in that suffering through which the redemption was accomplished. In bringing about the redemption through suffering, Christ has also raised human suffering to the level of the redemption. Thus, each man in his suffering can also become a sharer in the redemptive suffering of Christ. All right, so when we consider this, what we have to come to terms with is it's easy for us to say, and Dave, in the second half of the hour, will really unpack this. It's easy for us to say, well, we'll just offer it up. We'll offer up the suffering. Well, I don't want to suffer. I don't want to suffer. Suffering is horrible. Who wants to suffer? But we have to understand that the system that God created, the system that God established may not be a system that we like, but it's a system that works. And the system that God created and established is one where real change, real transformation will come about when you stretch yourself beyond what is even remotely comfortable and you enter into true abandonment of yourself for the other, and you do it voluntarily. And so Jesus has the most perfect example of this on the cross. He voluntarily gave up his own life. And so when we suffer, what actually is happening is we have an opportunity to make a choice. When we suffer, we can be selfish about it, and we can grumble and complain, and we can fight and kick and scream and say this is unfair, and why is everyone picking on me, and make this go away. Or we can have the attitude of, okay, I'm suffering. I might even be suffering unjustly. I'm suffering. What do I do with this? well, what if I was to do this? What if I was to make the decision that I will quietly endure this suffering and I will offer this pain in reparation for everything that Jesus did for me? What if I offer my pain and suffering to that? See, if we can do that, if we can consider that, if we can do that even a little bit, then maybe we can cooperate a little bit with Jesus with what he did for us.
Deacon, contentment. Sometimes we can suffer and not lose that contentment, that trust in God, that absolute peace. You have any suggestions on how we can overcome the bad thoughts that we may have while we're suffering and go to that point of contentment with God, but still be able to suffer good?
Yeah, well, good luck with that. Because, I mean, we all struggle with that.
Yeah.
I mean, right?
Yeah.
We were talking off the air. Off the air. By the way, those of you that are listening, Dave and I, we get together probably about a half hour before we start the show, and we just start throwing different comments back and forth. And we were both sharing with each other about how, the devil attacks us constantly.
Hmm.
It's so easy. It is so easy to slip into an attitude of hopelessness. It's just so easy. It's so easy to slip into an attitude of this is not fair, and why am I bothering? Why am I bothering? It's just so easy to slip into that. And so yeah, contentment is a problem. Contentment is a real problem. I remember having a conversation with a priest, and he was talking about the issues of being content. And actually, I think I even in addition to this conversation, I think I actually heard Father Larry Richards talk a little bit about this one time, where I think it was him. I could be wrong, but I think it was him, and he kind of made the remarks of, if you're not, there is no standing still in the spiritual life. There is no standing still. If you're not growing, you're dying. And I remember one of my early spiritual directors was kind of making a similar comment where he had said to me, okay, I want you to take a look at the last 12 months of your life and do an assessment. How have you grown in the last 12 months? And if the answer is, I don't know, I don't think I've grown. I think I've just kind of stayed the course.
That's how I
Well,
feel.
his answer,
Yeah,
well,
that's
but here's the problem, because his reaction to me, would be, so then the last 12 months was a waste of time because
no,
you didn't grow.
no, that's true.
See, I mean, because contentment is wicked. I mean, it is so easy to just say, you know what? I'm not going to do anything new. I'm not going to learn anything new. I'm not going to put myself out there in a new way because I'm afraid. And that's really what it comes back to, right? I mean, Dave, we've had this conversation about the radio show. I've shared with you, it's like, I am genuinely weary of the temptations that would come our way should the show become more and more successful. The temptations to grow a big fat ego, the temptations to, whatever there might be, to be lazy and content, to blow off other things that I might have going on in my life and thinking, oh, well, this is more important than everything else. The fear that comes along with contentment, it's a real fear. So what do you do? What do you do? We're always afraid of suffering. We're always afraid of being hurt. We're always, one of the reasons why a lot of people don't extend themselves and, put themselves out there to explore and to be adventurous and to try new things is because there's a fear of failure. Well, I'm going to be made fun of if I get it wrong. I'm going to lose money and it'll be a waste of money or whatever it is. And so there's a real tendency, because you're afraid to suffer, there's a real tendency to just do nothing.
I don't know if Deacon, I believe that what we experienced in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve did, was pure and perfect contentment. And I think that's what we're trying to get back to on our journey. Yeah, our faith journey is trying to get us back to that perfect contentment where, yeah, we have to go out and toil and labor to make a living, but we do it perfectly because we know that God is in charge. And everything goes back to Jesus, I trust in you. That contentment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Okay, so when was that a reality? That was a reality before the fall, right?
Right.
Okay. When will that be a reality again? After we die?
Can it? Well, no, but can it be
No.
now?
Well, not
can't
really. Well, we can design. Okay, well, but not perfectly. Not perfectly. Perfectly, it will be once we enter into the beatific vision.
Right.
Then it will be perfectly, because that's kind of how it was for Adam and Eve before the fall, right? They were walking in the garden with God, and so we go back to that after we die and we enter into the beatific vision. What we experience now, the best we can hope for. I mean, none of us are Padre Pio. None of us are bilocating, and we're not John Paul II having personal conversations with the Blessed Mother face to face and stuff like that. And
how cool would that be?
It would be very cool. But I guarantee you, most of us would probably freak out first and not believe it. We're not Saint Faustina having personal conversations with Jesus at night, in our bedrooms.
She was another one I was going to mention.
Well, yeah.
And Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote the book,
Right.
the Way of Perfection.
Yes, I mean it would be amazing if we had that encounter, if we had that experience. But the reality is, let's not set ourselves up for disappointment. The reality is, the many of us are just going to grope our way through the world, trusting on Jesus and being led by faith in the Holy Spirit. That as we grope through the world, we get closer and closer to enlightenment, and understand.
That's all the time we have this week. Tune in next week at this same time for the conclusion of this broadcast.
Don't forget to check out Deacon Don Prendergast on Facebook at Through the Fire. You want to check him out on YouTube? Just go to Through the Fire with Deacon Don Prendergast, Rumble at Deacon Don, and you can always check both of us out at www.castingthe.net. Go there and check out the Through the Fire page, and please leave a question that you'd like for us to answer. So
yes, and also, Dave, if I can jump in here.
Yep.
Whatever radio station you're hearing this show on, let the radio station know what you think. Send an email and share the program with other people.
So until next week, I'm David Fortin.
And I'm Deacon Don.
God bless.
The preceding program was the Spirit of Truth Radio Arts original program for CastingThe.net.